"The cold will take me if you shut that door," she said. "Nowhere left to run." The door hit the frame and bounced back open because I hadn't fixed the latch, and that's the only reason I heard her. I'd been meaning to fix it since October. Shim the top hinge, get a new catch plate from Harmon's in town. Kept putting it off the way a man alone puts things off when there's nobody to notice the draft. That night the cold came down hard out of the north, the kind that gets under the floorboards and doesn't leave until April, and I'd shut the fire damper too soon so the kitchen was already pulling air from every gap it could find. The door swung open maybe 4 inches, and I turned to push it closed again, and that's when I saw the shadow on the porch boards. Not a shape exactly. Just a darker dark against the gray snow light, and then a sound that wasn't wind. I had the Winchester off the hook above the door before I thought about it. 14 years on this piece of ground, you move without deciding to move. I pulled the door all the way open and there she was on one knee, one hand pressed flat against the porch post, her whole body shaking so hard I could hear her coat rattling against itself. Dark hair plastered to the side of her face. No hat. Boots soaked through. She looked up at me and said, clear as anything, like she had rehearsed the exact words she would say if she got this far. "The cold will take me if you shut that door." Not a question, not a plea, just a fact laid out in front of me. I stepped back and let her in. Her name was Cora Vass. She told me that much while she stood over the stove with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee and her boots steaming on the hearth stone. She told me she'd been walking for 3 hours and that the horse had gone lame just past the dry fork of Reese Creek, and she'd had to leave it. When I asked her where she'd come from, she looked at the stove and didn't answer. I didn't push. A man who has lived alone long enough knows when a question has already been weighed and set down deliberate. I put her in the room off the kitchen. It had been my wife's sewing room and then just a storeroom for 6 years. I moved 2 crates of fence staples and a box of old harness leather, and I found the wool blanket I kept on the top shelf, and I didn't say anything about the room, what it had been. She didn't ask. She sat on the edge of the cot and she was still shaking and she said, without looking up, "I'm not going to cause you trouble." "All right," I said. "I mean it. I heard you." I left her there and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the yard. Snow was coming down straight and steady, the way it does when it means to cover everything by morning. The lantern over the barn door was swinging in a wind I couldn't hear through the glass. I thought about what I was doing, thought about it plainly the way I do with most things. A woman shows up at your door in a killing cold, you let her in. That's not complicated. What might be complicated was the thing she hadn't told me. I put more wood on the fire and went to bed. She was up before me. I came out to find coffee already made, and the skillet on the heat with salt pork crisping in it, and she was standing at the window looking out at the same yard I'd been looking at the night before. The snow had come down hard, and the fence line closest to the house was buried to the second rail. She'd found an old shirt of mine hanging on the peg by the washstand and put it on over her dress. The shirt came down past her hips and the sleeves were rolled 6 times. She said without turning around, "Your horse is all right, I checked him. There's a loose board on the south wall of the stall, just needs a nail." "I know," I said. She turned then and looked at me. She had dark eyes, steady. She'd been pretty once and she was still, in the way a landscape is pretty when the weather has been at it. "I'll fix it today," she said. "And I saw your woodpile I can split." "You don't have to earn your keep," I said. "I know I don't," she turned back to the window. "I want to." There's a difference, I understood it. Her horse was alive. I found it at the creek bend that afternoon when the snow eased off, standing in a willow brake with one foreleg cocked, eating whatever bark it could reach. The left foreleg below the fetlock, a bad stone bruise, maybe a hairline crack in the hoof wall, hard to say without a proper look. I got a rope on him and walked him back slow, and he came without much argument because horses are practical about being saved. I said nothing to her about finding him until I'd cleaned the leg and packed it and got him settled in the stall next to mine. Then I came in and washed my hands and told her. She said, "How bad?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. He'll be sound again. She nodded. Something shifted in her face that she didn't let turn into anything. She'd been rolling biscuit dough on the floured board and she went back to it. "That's longer than I planned to stay," she said. "Your horse," I said. "Your business." She pressed the cutter down into the dough. "You're not going to ask me?" "No." She looked at me then. I was drying my hands on the flour sack towel and I met her eyes and she held it for a moment, reading something in my face. Whatever she found there, she seemed to decide it was enough. "His name is Dillard Cross," she said. "He runs the silver operation out of Elko. I worked for him, kept his ledgers, and then I saw his ledgers." She went back to the biscuits. "He'll come looking," she said. "I expect he will," I said. I hung the towel on the hook and went to clean my boots. I want to say something about those first 2 weeks, before Cross and his man showed up. Because what happened after has a way of making people think the whole story is about that, and it isn't. The story is the 2 weeks. She worked. That was the first thing. She didn't wait to be told and she didn't do things to be thanked. She split a cord and a half of wood and stacked it clean against the north wall of the barn. She found the loose gutter bracket on the east side of the house and wired it down. She mended harness. She cooked plain and she cooked well, not performing it, just doing it, the way someone does a thing they've been doing their whole life. She didn't talk much in the mornings. Neither do I. By midday she'd loosened up some. By evening she'd tell me things, fragments, a town she'd lived in once, a sister in Sacramento she'd lost track of. She asked me questions that weren't personal but were interested, the way smart people ask questions. About the land. About how the ranch worked, the grazing rotation, the water rights I'd fought the Kessler outfit for in court the winter of '81. One evening she said, "You won that case yourself, no lawyer." "Couldn't afford one," I said. "Did you know anything about water law?" I knew what I needed to by the time it got to the hearing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's a particular kind of man." I didn't answer. I looked at the fire. "The kind that doesn't wait for someone else to solve his problem," she said. I still didn't answer, but I felt it. I am not going to pretend I didn't. The grieving part. I'll say it once because it matters to how I was then. Her name was Ruth. She died of a fever in the spring of '79, 6 months after the baby. The baby didn't make it either. I had a ranch and a water right lawsuit and nothing else, and I got up every morning because that's what you do when you have stock depending on you. And after a few years, the getting up was just the getting up again, and I stopped thinking about what else it might have been. A man can manage without happiness if he stays busy enough. I'd stopped believing I was the kind of man a woman would want around. I don't know exactly when Cora changed that. It wasn't one moment. It was the stacked wood and the wired gutter bracket and the steady eyes and the question about water law and the way she said, "A particular kind of man," and then was quiet. It was accumulation. Cross's man came on a Tuesday. He rode in from the west in the early afternoon, which told me he'd come from the direction of Winnemucca rather than Elko, which meant Cross had put the word out wide. His name was Fell, or that's what he said. Wide-bodied, 35 maybe, a canvas coat with a sheepskin collar. He had the kind of face that has practiced being pleasant. He asked me if I'd seen a woman on her own, dark hair, coming through on a horse that might be lame. I was leaning against the fence post at the near corner of the paddock. I'd come out when I heard the horse because I don't let riders get to the house without seeing them first. I said, "That's a specific description." He said, "She works for a man in Elko who's worried about her family situation." "I haven't seen anybody like that," I said. He looked at the house, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. My second horse was in the paddock, and Cora's roan gelding was in the barn out of sight. He looked back at me. He was trying to decide whether I was lying and what to do about it if I was. "You run this place alone," he said. "For 6 years. He nodded slowly. He said, "If you do see her, Mr. Cross would be grateful for the information. He's a man who remembers who's been helpful." "I expect he is," I said. He held my gaze another moment, then reined his horse around and went back the way he came. I watched him until he was over the ridge. Then I went into the barn and stood there in the smell of hay and horse and let my heart settle back down. Cora was in the loft. She'd climbed up there when she heard the rider coming, and she came down now, backward down the ladder, bits of hay on her shoulders. "Fell," she said. "He's Cross's main man. He doesn't leave something when Cross sends him after it." "He'll be back," I said. "Yes." I looked at her. She was standing at the bottom of the ladder with her hands at her sides, and she was, for the first time, afraid. Not of me. Just afraid, the kind of fear that a person has been outrunning for a while, and that's finally caught up to them in a hayloft in Nevada. "Then we'll deal with him when he comes," I said. I didn't say anything else. I went to the tack room to check the Winchester and the Colt and make sure both were loaded. I heard her behind me after a moment, following, not because she needed to see what I was doing, but because the barn felt safer if we were both in it. I'll tell you what I know about being a man that other men respect, since this is partly about that. It is not loud. It is not performed. It is a function, the same way a good hinge functions, the same way a fence post functions when the wire is tight and the ground is frozen. People know it when the thing does what it's supposed to do under conditions where a cheaper version would fail. I was 51 years old that winter. I had built this ranch from a land patent and $6 and a horse that wasn't mine until the man I worked for got thrown and never walked right after. I had fought one lawsuit and won it. I had survived a winter in '74 that killed 4 men I knew and 60% of the cattle in the valley. I had buried a wife and a child, and I had kept getting up. What I had not done, in 6 years, was have any reason to think it mattered to anyone other than the stock. She changed that, not by saying it exactly, by seeing it. By asking questions about the water law and then being quiet in a way that said, "I understand what it takes to be the kind of man who does that." Cross himself came 4 days later. He didn't send Fell ahead. He came with Fell beside him and a third man I didn't recognize trailing back. 3 horses at the gate in the late morning, snow thin on the ground, the sky the color of old tin. I came out onto the porch before they reached the house. Cross was maybe 55. Silver hair under a black hat, good coat, the kind of boots that are expensive without advertising it. He had a cordial face, which is the most dangerous kind. He said, "Good morning. I'm looking for a woman named Cora Vass. I have reason to believe she may have taken refuge here." "What reason?" I said. "Fell spoke to you. He described her." "He described a woman," I said. "I told him I hadn't seen anybody." Cross smiled. He had very even teeth. "Mr. Aldred," I said. "Eli Aldred." "Mr. Aldred, I understand the impulse to protect a woman in difficulty. It speaks well of you. But this is a legal matter. She left my employ in possession of certain documents, and her return of those documents is a condition of the law's disinterest in what she may have done with them prior." He was good. That was a threat dressed so careful you'd almost miss it. "I haven't seen her," I said. Cross looked at the house. The door was closed. No smoke from the kitchen today. I'd asked her to let the fire go low. "I'd like to look," he said. "You won't," I said. Fell's hand moved. Just a shift in the weight of his arm toward the hip. I had the Winchester up before the shift finished. It went very quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the horses breathing. I said, "This is my land. You came onto it uninvited. The man on the left moves his hand again, and I'll put him down and write the county sheriff a letter explaining why. And if you're the man in Elko I think you are, the county sheriff is going to find that letter real interesting. Cross looked at the rifle. He looked at my face. He was doing what Fell had done 4 days ago, deciding whether I was a man he could push. He decided I wasn't. "We'll resolve this another way," he said. He said it pleasantly, like we were discussing a business arrangement. "The road's behind you," I said. He turned his horse. Fell and the third man followed. I kept the rifle up until they were over the second rise, and then I lowered it and my arms were shaking a little the way arms do when you've held something still for too long by will. The door opened behind me. Cora came out onto the porch. She didn't say anything. She stood beside me and looked at the empty road. After a while she said, "He's going to the county sheriff." "Yes," I said. "He'll claim I stole those documents." "He'll try," I said. She turned and looked at me. Her shoulder was 6 inches from mine, and she looked up and I looked down, and she said, "Why are you doing this?" I thought about it honest. "Because you knocked on my door," I said, "and the cold would have taken you." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She reached out and put her hand on my forearm, just rested it there and looked back at the road. "What do we do now?" she said. "We go to the county sheriff first," I said. "Today. You bring what you know about those ledgers and you tell it straight, and we let the law sort what it can sort." Her hand was still on my arm, and if it can't sort enough, then I've got a lawyer friend in Carson City who owes me a favor, I said. And if that's not enough, I know a man at the Territorial Land Office who Cross has been shorting on his assay fees for 3 years and is looking for a reason. She stared at me. "You thought all of that through," she said. "Last 4 days," I said. She was quiet. Then very quietly, "You thought all of that through for me." I didn't answer that, but I let her hand stay on my arm. I won't walk through the legal piece in detail. It took 11 days and 2 trips to Carson City and the lawyer friend. His name was Pierce, old man with a bad knee who'd beaten the railroad in 3 separate cases, and in the end Cross settled on terms that left him considerably diminished and Cora clear. The ledger entries she'd copied out in her own hand, folded into the lining of her coat the night she ran, those were the fulcrum. Pierce said he'd never seen a cleaner piece of documentation work. "Your girl's meticulous," he told me in the hallway outside the judge's office, and I didn't correct the "your girl" because it wasn't something I wanted to correct. We drove back from Carson City in the wagon in the dark, because we'd stayed for the late session and then dinner with Pierce and his wife, who served good mutton and better wine, and asked Cora more questions in 2 hours than I had in 3 weeks. It was cold and clear. Stars packed in hard above the road, the kind of night where the air is so dry it almost crackles. Cora had a blanket over her lap, and she was sitting close enough that our shoulders touched with every rut in the road. She said Pierce's wife asked if we were married. "I heard," I said. I told her not yet. I kept my eyes on the road. The horse, mine, hers was still healing, was picking his way along the frozen ruts in the particular careful way he has when he knows I'm paying attention. "Not yet," I said. "I'm a straightforward woman," she said. "I've noticed. And you're a particular kind of man. I said that a while back and I meant it." "You did say it." "I mean it more now." She shifted the blanket on her lap. "You could have shut that door." "I couldn't," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I don't think you could have." We went on in the dark. The wagon creaked on the frozen ground. An owl crossed the road somewhere ahead of us, a pale shape there and gone. She put her head against my shoulder. I held the reins and I didn't say anything, but I felt the weight of her there, and I thought about 6 years of nothing mattering except the stock, and I thought about water law and a bad hinge latch and 3 men at the gate and a hand on my forearm, and I thought, This is the thing you work toward without knowing you're working toward it. I am not a man who says things like that out loud. I kept driving. But I reached over with one hand and put it over both of hers where they rested on the blanket, and she turned her palm up and held it. She stayed, that's the short of it. Her horse healed. The roan gelding turned out to have better bloodlines than either of us had looked close enough to notice, and he and my horse got along well enough to run in the same paddock, which is not a given, and matters more than people think if you're going to live somewhere long. She wrote to her sister in Sacramento and got a letter back inside the month. I fixed the door latch and the barn board, and 4 other things I'd been putting off because there was someone to notice the draft. In March, she went to Carson City for a week to help Pierce organize the cross-referenced ledger copies that the territorial prosecutor's office wanted for a larger inquiry into Cross's operation. She was good at it. Pierce told me 3 times in separate letters that she was the most organized person he'd worked with in 30 years. I wrote back once to say I knew. She came home on a Thursday. I had supper on the stove because I'd known which stage she'd make, and she walked in the door with cold air coming in behind her, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove and looked at me and she said, "You cooked." "I can cook," I said. "I know you can," she said. She set down her bag and came across the kitchen and she looked up at me with those steady dark eyes and she put both hands flat on my chest, and I put my arms around her, and she said into my collar quietly, like she was saying it to herself as much as to me, "I made the right choice." I held her there in the kitchen with the supper steaming and the fire going and the cold outside pressing against every crack in the wall, and finding nothing it could get through, and I didn't say anything. Some things don't need an answer. The territory changed. The silver played out of Cross's operation inside of 2 years once the territorial inquiry was done with him, and a lot of the men who'd worked for him scattered. I never saw again. Cross himself went to San Francisco, and then, from what I heard, to ruin by degrees, the kind of quiet ruin that happens to men who are used to buying their way out of things when the buying stops working. I am not going to pretend I mourned that. The ranch I still have. Cora and I married in June, a Thursday morning in the judge's office in Winnemucca with Pierce and his wife as witnesses, and then we drove back the same road we'd driven that night in the dark, except it was summer and the sage was out, and her roan gelding had been fully sound for 2 months, and she was riding alongside me with her hat down her back and her dark hair loose. She asked me once, a few years on, what I'd been thinking that night at the gate with the rifle up and the 3 horses in the road. I thought about it. "I was thinking," I said, "that a man protects what's his." She looked at me sideways. "I wasn't yours yet," she said. "You were on my land," I said. She shook her head, but she was smiling, and that was enough. That has always been enough.